Hello everyone, I'm Mick Sass, one of the 6 inspectors for RVIA. Today we are going to discuss issues involved with protecting propane system piping and hose as it pertains to slideouts. These requirements of the NFPA 1192 are common deviations found by the inspection staff during our normal RVIA production facility inspections. The purpose of this mini webinar is to provide information about the flexible gas hoses that bring propane to appliances located in the slide-out portion of our recreational vehicles. We will review code requirements and illustrate how those requirements can be implemented. Please note that the information presented here does not provide the only methods for protecting propane lines in a slide-out. This information is intended to be used as a guide for protection. There are many methods that can and do provide the required protection that follow the NFPA 1192 RV standards. It also should be noted that these issues have been frequently cited by the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration recalls. These NHTSA recalls in some cases were initiated by the manufacturer of the RV based on findings from our RVIA inspections. Others were initiated by the manufacturers themselves based on internal audits of their product. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration does require that safety-related deviations be reported to them. With the wide variety of RVs and slide-out configurations, assuring that installation of all propane systems in the slide-out are done properly and in compliance with all current standards is vital. So let's get started. Some of this information is very basic and applies not only to the slide-outs, but to all portions of the RV under 5.3.8 of the code. Although the code here refers to both tubing and hose, our main purpose for this presentation is to concentrate on the flexible, non-metallic or rubber hose used to provide propane gas to the slideouts. Grommets are commonly used to protect copper tubing and flex hose in the propane system. Grommets must fit snugly and be secured in position so they will continually provide the required protection. Here we have 3 different types of grommets. The photo on the right is of rubber grommets that come in specific sizes and are commonly seen protecting copper or rubber hose as it passes through the sheet metal of an appliance such as a water heater. The long white grommet is commonly used in many configurations, including passing through wood and metal. There's only one problem that I have seen with these grommets. They sometimes cut too short and don't cover both sides of the material they pass through. The black plastic grommet is specifically designed to clip into holes of aluminum framing. These are not commonly going to be seen protecting propane hose or copper tubing, as they are specifically intended for aluminum framing such as aluminum wall studs. As we all know, the 1192 prohibits concealing of propane piping in walls and in floors. So the use of the proper grommet must always be considered in the material being used. Again, grommet protection applies to all floors, walls, partitions, and to framing or chassis members on both the slide-out and main body of the RV. Also remember that a grommet or grommets must cover both sides of the material the hose is passing through so that there are no rough edges damaging the hose or the copper tubing. The picture on the left shows a run of iron pipe and copper tubing in the slide-out. In this case, the copper tubing runs down to the connection with the flexible propane hose. There are a couple of problems here. First, the grommet is missing as it passes through the aluminum frame on the floor of that slide-out wall. Secondly, part of protection involves the proper installation of iron pipe and copper tubing that is connecting to this flex hose. Here, the required support and securement between the end of the iron pipe and its last securement must be 6 inches or less. So the metal plumber's tape seen on the far right is probably about 8 inches from the copper tubings running into the floor. After all, the junction box alone is 4 inches wide at a minimum, with an additional couple of inches on either side for the T-fitting and a length of iron pipe next to the plumber's tape. So this part of the propane installation on the slide out would be incorrect because it's not providing adequate support. In addition to protecting the flex hose as it passes through walls, floors, and partitions, the entire length of the hose needs to be accessible for inspection. So, in some slide-out configurations, where the propane hose passes through an area where there is a space larger than the thickness of a floor or a wall, access panels may be required. Or, an additional length of hose may be needed so that it can be pulled back through the grommets on either side to inspect the hose entire length. Routing of the propane hose is of vital importance when considering its protection in a slide-out application. In this photograph, we see the routing of a propane hose to the slide-out while in the open position. This configuration creates a potential for chafing and crimping of the hose on the slide-out arm. When the slide-out is in the retracted position for traveling, the propane hose will not be supported adequately enough and thus be subjected to potential damage from road debris. Routing can be accomplished more effectively by assuring that the propane hose is secured to the interior channels of the slide-out extension arms. Taking a closer look at the slide-out's extension arm, we see that it cradles two 120-volt SJ cables in the lower slide-out arm's tray. Remember that the 120-volt wires, as well as the low-voltage 12-volt wires, need to be protected from damage in both the travel and open slide-out positions. These are requirements of the NEC, the National Electric Code, and the ANSI RVIA low-volt standard. In addition to proper routing of the propane hose on the interior of the slide-out arm, a length of protective coil spring has also been installed. This spring support will maintain the diameter of the propane hose in its retracted position where it is subjected to the stress of its smallest bend radius. Providing this additional spring support may be necessary to avoid kinking of the hose when the slide-out is in the travel position. Remember to always evaluate the propane hose, the 120-volt wires, and the 12-volt conductors with the slide-out in both the open and retracted positions to ensure that there are no issues with kinking, chafing, or stress of any kind. Here we see a closer picture of the coil spring support used in a tight bend radius situation of a slide-out extension arm. This method of protection is provided with the use of a coil spring similar to that of a tube bender, which is placed around the propane hose at the point the hose is subjected to the bending movement of the extension arm. As seen in this photograph, the propane line is secured with zip ties on both ends of the coil spring, maintaining the location of the spring at the bend location. The use of such protection assures that kinking of the propane hose will not occur in any position the extension arm is placed. In this slide, we see that physical damage can occur when sharp metal edges of this trailer's skirt are allowed to come into contact with the rubber propane hose. In this case, the skirt of the RV has caused an abrasion on the exterior rubber hose. With continued movement of the slide out from the travel mode to the extended usable position, this abrasion will ultimately result in a hole being worn in the rubber propane hose and creating a potential leak. Also note that the length of the hose may need to be increased so that there is no stress on the fitting connections. As discussed in the previous photograph, hose length is important in the smooth and safe operation of the slide-out extension arm. The photograph on the right shows a close-up of a kink in the propane hose at the fitting connection. This situation can restrict the flow of propane to the associated appliances. It also places excessive stress on the hose at the attached fitting. This repeated strain on the fitting can eventually create a leak at the fitting itself, as well as potentially loosening the brass fitting. Now, in this photo, it shows careful routing of the propane hose and electrical cables in a kitchen slide-out extension arm. Care should also be taken to assure that the propane hose extending to the slide-out is protected from wheels, axles, suspension components, and other moving parts found under the chassis of the RV. Not only do propane lines need to be routed away from moving components under the chassis, but as seen here with these 12-volt conductors in loom, they could easily be damaged by the movement of the suspension system. Again, assure that all your 120-volt wires, your 12-volt conductors, and any propane hoses are protected from potential physical damage caused by moving components and road debris. In addition to assuring that the propane hose is protected from moving components of the RV itself, a specific requirement for the distance from the tire's tread to the unprotected propane hose is required by NFPA 1192. The distance required from the tread of the tire to the propane hose is a minimum of 12 inches. This is only for that area directly in front of the tread. Technically, as written, the area of the sidewall that extends up to the tread is not considered part of this 12-inch requirement, as seen as the illustration on the left. However, from a common sense standpoint, keeping propane hoses the minimum distance away from any part of the tire is a wise choice. When possible, routing the propane hose and other components completely away from the wheels and the suspension is always the best policy. Finally, retaining springs. In this slide, another method of securing propane lines and electrical wiring is the retaining spring. The use of retaining spring, such as those used on some screen doors, can be an adequate method for protection. Remember that using the correct spring is a bit of a balancing act. It must be strong enough to support the hose and wire bundles in both the retracted or travel position, as well as in the slide out open or extended position. The proper length of a spring must hold the hose and the wiring snug without sagging when the slide out is in the travel position where there is little tension on the spring. And the spring cannot be too short, thus creating excessive tension when the slide out extended to the open position. Too much tension from the spring could damage the hose and or wiring or crimp the hose at its brass fittings. The retention spring also needs to be secured at a location on the propane hose so that it does not create a crimp. Additional support at this point may also be necessary to avoid kinking the propane hose. In some situations, the use of tie wraps as seen here would not be adequate, as the as it could damage the hose and or the wiring. A tie wrap could also simply fail over time, leaving the wire to sag down and be exposed to potential road debris damage. And again, thanks for attending this mini webinar concerning the protection of propane lines in Slideouts. This and other mini webinars are available on our RVIA Standards YouTube station.